Ahoy there, weary traveller. I have here a collection of spoilers for ye. Be ye seeking that sort of thing? If not, begone with ye. Good evening. Welcome to another video in my series discussing the lore of Rainworld the Watcher. This time, I'll be individually analyzing each and every region added in the DLC, trying to glean whatever lore I can from the Watcher's fragmented map. Now, when I say I'm analyzing these regions, I'm not just talking about the layout of the map. I'm talking specifically about the structures themselves that we see. I'm going to be trying to analyze and understand the actual purpose of these ruined facilities, trying to figure out what they could have at one point been for, and trying to understand what that could imply about the society of their creators. I'm also going to be trying to place them in relative proximity to each other. I know quite a few of these regions are very likely literally connected to each other, but we'll get into that in the video. This video will be highly speculative, and there's a solid chance I miss some details as I am analyzing architecture and machinery as someone who is neither an architect nor works with machinery. So if you catch something I didn't, I implore you to take it to the comments. I'll heart your comment if you present something cool that I didn't notice, or if you're funny enough. Also, before we begin, shoutouts to Alderus for their proper Watcher map that has made making this project just so much easier. So, without further ado, let's begin the video where my playthrough began, Coral Caves. This area is one of the weirder ones. It takes place in a massive array of oceanic caves covered in coral and other underwater life, with most of the inhabitants being oceanic in nature. Giant jellyfish, salamanders, eel lizards, leviathans, and the new tardigrades, who are actually more like nudibranches or sea pigs, but I'm saving that rant for flora-fauna. This implies that at one point this entire area was underwater, allowing the corals to actually grow along the cave walls. And it was either just recently drained, or it has some sort of high tide, low tide thing going on, and the upper half of the area is submerged at some point. Though I'd like to present a different theory. On the left side of the area, we can see what looks to be a gargantuan water pipe with a huge rupture. This suggests that the area was either drained by that pipe, or after the pipe broke, the water all spilled out. The lower half of the region is still flooded, and the entire region is filled with architecture that makes it look like the benefactors wanted this region for something. Judging by the amount of pipes built into the walls, they could have been draining water from here, or it could have been a shoreline situation, as the architecture here looks very similar to the architecture found in Shoreline, with this big-ass tower in the middle being the main standout to compare the two regions. So if I had to put together a theory, I'd say that similar to Shoreline, this area is likely a site designed to have water drained from it, desalinated, and then pumped into an iterator to serve as coolant. We can tell that the area was at least functioning properly for a good period of time. The infrastructure that was built here suggests a lot of time and effort being put into making sure that this area was sufficiently capable of being drained. And the fact that we can see the coral having grown over and around those pipes in the area that is no longer submerged implies that the pipes were built when the area was at some point submerged. Though, obviously, after the large pipe itself ruptured, the facility is likely no longer in working order. Alright, that's the first area checked off the list. That moves us on to Turbulent Pump. Not because it's the immediate next area on the list, but because it's thematically tied to my idea for coral caves. Realistically, the main reason I'm connecting them in the first place is because Turbulent Pump used to actually be a part of the Coral Caves mod before they were separated into the Watcher regions. Now, I'm unsure if this is actually important information we're meant to take into account, but either way, it lets me connect the theories. I think Turbulent Pump is, well, a pump. Not just that, I think it's the pump that connected to Coral Caves, likely one that leads to an iterator superstructure. This is due not just to the original mod relation, but also due to the area itself having the same coral-like structures alongside some of its rockier walls. Considering Watcher takes place all over the timeline, this could be a variant of the pump network before the pipe to Coral Caves got disconnected. Considering the fact that the machinery still seems to be functional for the most part, with the water current still flowing, I imagine the intended connection point that the pump is pulling from is still functional at this point in the timeline. The actual direction of the currents seems fairly inconsistent, so it's hard to glean much from the actual pipe itself. But even just eyeballing the size of the pipes to the disconnected Coral Caves pipe, they line up almost perfectly with the size of it. So I'm fairly content saying that even if this doesn't directly lead to where Coral Caves is, it is almost certainly a similar spot to one that would exist around the Coral Caves area. Alright, let's just knock out all the modded regions and their original subregions first. So next up we have all the regions that used to be a part of Stormy Coast. I wonder which one we should start with. I mean, it would make sense to start with Torrential Waterways. I'm joking, we're starting with Stormy Coast. Stormy Coast is fairly easy to understand, even the wiki says it. It's the remains of an old shipping dock with a thunderstorm raging overhead. You can see a variety of old cranes with hooks attached, a number of shipping containers, and seemingly a bunch of electrical gizmos here and there. The electricity that arcs between these certified doohickeys is the same coloration as the lightning. Could there be some sort of lightning rods to generate power here? I can't imagine there'd be too many functioning electrical devices in this area considering the level of decay. And something tells me there's not a lot of functioning power grids out there nowadays. So the facility has to be harvesting this power from the lightning itself. Now, what they would be powering with all this lightning? I have no clue. There aren't many working electrical devices to actually utilize that power. It's not like the cranes move or the lights flicker inside the facility, so I have no idea what they could be using all that stored power for. It's unclear if the storm is always happening in this area in lore, or just occurring during this one specific stretch of time that we're visiting the area in. Either way, Stormy Coast is fairly simple. It's a dock designed for loading and offloading cargo from large ships. Cool, I wonder what's next. 0 points if you guessed that it was Shrouded Coast. I wonder what this area is. If your guess was this is just Stormy Coast again, congratulations, you win this prize that crowns you as Captain Obvious. It's Stormy Coast, but it's shrouded by clouds and not raining. This is either before the storm rolled in or just after it ended. I'd imagine before, though, because of some meta-knowledge, so take it with a grain of salt, but Shrouded Coast was originally a variant of Stormy Coast made for Spearmaster's campaign, which is the earliest in the timeline. Due to this reasoning, I believe it's before the storm started. This area likely showcases the part of the greater Stormy Coast shipping dock, where the shipping containers are taken from the large ships and stored. You can tell this primarily because the vast majority of the region takes place above and underneath and around a massive array of stacked shipping containers. The area itself is fairly flat, so I imagine it's further inland from the area we saw in Stormy Coast. Additionally, there's a little bit of questionably canon graffiti showing the classic Five Pebbles reaction image. I wouldn't bring this up usually. I tend not to want to take graffiti outside of very specific examples particularly seriously, as there are enough joke graffiti images for me to be tentative about taking them as something we're supposed to look super hard into. But if they do matter, this could mean that the shipping dock is nearby to the base Rain World map, as I highly doubt a joke image like this could have been made without intimate knowledge of Five Pebbles. But it's probably just a dev shitpost, all things considered. The next region on the list is yet another version of Stormy Coast. Wow. Torrential Waterways was originally a sub-region of the Stormy Coast region. Well, actually, it wasn't a sub-region, it was just its own series of rooms that was designated as a sub-region, but, you know, whatever. Here, it's a fairly simplistic region, mostly comprised of a bunch of elevated railways and a constant rainstorm. Beneath the railways is a relatively deep layer of water that is constantly being disturbed by the rainstorm, flooding a bunch of old train cars carrying shipping containers. Most of the things that live here are semi-aquatic, living in the water sources the rain has made below. This one is another fairly easy home run slam dunk for what it is. These are almost certainly the railways that lead into and out of the Stormy Coast shipping dock, carrying the shipping containers loaded onto the area to and fro. Where it is in the timeline is the hard part. If I had to guess, it's right before Stormy Coast proper, before the storm graduated to a full-on thunderstorm with lightning and shit. Alright, next up on the list is Sunlit Port. So, viewers, what do you think this is? Take your guesses. Is it either A, a variant of Coral Caves, B, its own unique region, C, a stale wheel of Gouda cheese, or D, just fucking Stormy Coast again? If you answered anything other than D, you really don't know how YouTube videos are structured, do you? Yeah, it's another variant of Stormy Coast. This time it's Artificer's variant of Stormy Coast, with the weather altered to be sunny. This being Artificer's variant means that it likely took place between Shrouded and the Stormy Coast, but Again, this occurs before the Watcher started development, so it's likely that the original timeline placements aren't that important anymore. Either way, this area is fairly basic. It's more or less just kind of a walk in the park. It's a sunlit variant of Stormy Coast. The only thing I can think of would be these weird neon signs, likely just designed as a way to designate certain areas, like areas to load or unload cargo. Either way, even without the meta-knowledge that ties this area to Stormy Coast, we could kinda just do it anyway because it's called Sunlit Port. A port is built along a coast, and it's making a very clear effort to describe the weather. Besides that though, Sunlit Port is tiny and empty, so there's not really much else to glean from this area. Oh boy, is everybody ready? It's time to examine 6 out of the 7 regions in this DLC that are all Aether Ridge. Starting out with Aether Ridge, as can be predicted. Aether Ridge is uniquely hard to understand. Ooh. We have a lot of tools to figure out what it could be used for, but very little of it actually connects to anything people do in real life. So let me describe it. Aether Ridge is a tall facility covered in pipes, and seemingly salty, according to the wiki, which has been built upon a large mountain ridge. The saltiness is likely due to the pools of glowing white brine that are seen within the lower section, known as the Ridgeworks. They're primarily found in cylindrical tanks connected by pipes. The brine itself kills you almost instantly on contact, implying it's either just that volatile or it is incredibly cold, which could also be suggested by it glowing a pale bluish white, which cold things do not do in real life, but it kind of feels like a game design thing to indicate that this fluid is cold as shit, compared to the effects they put on the bubbling acid that would imply chemical volatility. Now, in my opinion, this brine is the key to the puzzle that is Aether Ridge. I believe that the purpose of Aether Ridge is to create this super-cooled brine and ship it across the aerial tramway to other areas, either for uses in experiments or as a power source. This brine likely has a number of uses, not that I could think of any, it just seems generally useful in a weird sci-fi way. The main curiosity here is in the name of the third subregion, the Blast Deck. There's nothing I can find that would be described as a blast deck, so I'm lost on this one. It's just a very generic bit of exterior machinery that occasionally can be seen pumping the brine throughout the region. I can't really analyze the whole of Aether Ridge without the context of its other connected regions, though, so let's get to that. The first connected region is arguably the one that tells us the most, that being salination. Hey gang, do you know what brine is? That's right, it's super salty water. Do you know what it means to salinate something? To make it salty! Now, gamers and gamerettes, can you guess what my theory on salination is? Sorry, I had to include that one for all the 13-year-olds in my audience. Make sure you study up for your math test, David. You need to get a good grade, or your parents are going to start shouting at each other again. But to clarify, for those that still don't really get it, I believe that salination is where seawater, or fresh water, is taken and thoroughly salinated to create the base of the brine to be pumped up to Aether Ridge and then supercooled in whatever the Ridgeworks does to create the glowing white brine that we see in Aether Ridge. Now, the water in salination that makes up most of its flooded lower section is already likely salty, as can be shown through its cloudy gray-blue coloration. The color of the water is another thing that makes this theory, pun not intended, watertight, because this exact same type of grayish-blue water also shows up in Aether Ridge within the Ridgeworks. But now that I've made my theory on salination, there's only one thing that I really want to talk about in the region, and that's this one really out-of-place fan near the top of it, which connects, very importantly, to our next region, heat ducts. The next area, originally a part of Aether Ridge, I mostly bring it up because it doesn't have much connection to Aether Ridge, but this one bitch-ass fan in salination makes me want to connect them because as far as I'm aware, these fans literally only appear in heat ducts and nowhere else. Heat ducts does have a fairly decent case for being connected to Aether Ridge by itself, though. Now, heat ducts itself is fairly obviously the area where a lot of heat is vented through ducts from a fairly large industrial facility. Now, you know what the first step when making a substance super cold is? You have to remove all the heat from it, and that heat doesn't go away. So if Aether Ridge is making a shitload of super cold brine, they'd have to take the heat and vent it somewhere. Thus, heat ducts. Besides that basic observation, though, the area is incredibly unique in what it shows us. The actual subregion known as Thermal Relay shows a unique type of coil, which presumably just produces heat, but it doesn't instantly kill the Watcher when they touch it. It takes a few hits to do so. There's also the literal jets of fire which come out of the areas, which don't look like just raw heat. They look almost like some sort of burner, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is just some incredibly hot air to the extent that it creates fire. But outside of the unique machinery, it also has a bit of unique creatures to it, the primary ones that I want to discuss here being the fire sprites and the boxworms. Now, I can't really discuss a lot of them outside of flora fauna, but the main thing to discuss is that these creatures are weirdly mechanical, which implies that these areas were created after the purposed organism technology became super widespread. Either that, or the boxworms and fire sprites are super primitive purposed organisms, which could also make sense. I'm not sure. Moving on. Alright, cold storage. This is probably the weirdest region we've discussed so far, not because it's particularly hard to determine what is happening here, but because it shows something that's not really been shown before, that being the ways that purposed organisms were researched. I'm not sure how to connect this area to Aether Ridge, as it doesn't have anything to do with the brine production that we've seen so far. It also doesn't have a connection to the aerial tramway subregion of Aether Ridge, unless I am stupid, which is also possible. So for now, I have no idea if it's actually connected to Aether Ridge. What I am certain of is the purpose of the facility. Cold storage is very likely a research facility. You can see cages, tubes, and dead lizards dotting the area. The amount of lizards here implies that they were originally test subjects, as shown by the fact that many of them still reside in cages. There's also the Station Annex subregion, which is filled to the brim with rot. As we know from the base game, rot tends to be a pretty notable side result of purposed organism research gone too far. But this is the purple sentient rot that grows from the prince's business, so I'm not sure if we're meant to read into this as a thing that happened specifically in cold storage, or something that was caused by the connection to unfortunate evolution that lies within Station Annex, which, trust me, I'm going to be getting to unfortunate evolution in like 20 to 30 minutes. Our next two subregions do something that I think is really cool, and I am disappointed the Watcher did not do more. Those two areas being Fetid Glen and the Surface. They're both future versions of a region that we've already seen, specifically Salination and Aether Ridge. We'll start with the Surface because it's a lot less interesting. This area shares a lot of rooms with Aether Ridge, including the existence of the aerial tramway. The fallen tramway. So now we know that it's in the future. Well, not just because everything's all fucked up and broken, but because the rooms literally say future on them in the files. You can't really get more open and shut than that. These future rooms include not only rooms from Aether Ridge, but also rooms from heat ducts, which confirms that they're very close to each other. Besides that, the surface is mostly characterized by how cold it is, introducing a Saint-esque heat mechanic, as well as having large plains of frozen liquid, which I assume is water because brine is kinda incredibly hard to freeze. This area, being so far in the future and having all the hallmarks of the Saint timeline, does make it interesting when analyzing Downpour and Watcher's potential connections, but I won't harp on it. I made a whole video discussing the differences between the DLCs. Right, moving on to Fetid Glen. This is much more interesting because this was Salination in the past. Almost exactly. Look at some of these rooms. Over time, the area has been transformed into a massive fungal swamp, now sporting some really unique wildlife, including a fully unique lizard species, the basilisk lizards, as well as a truckload of insects and the parasitic frogs. The mushrooms here are really the star attraction, though. They've grown so large and numerous that they've clouded the air with spores that give the whole area a weird look that made me think that it was a lot more lore important than it actually is. The entire area has a weird rainbowy sheen to it. Now, out of all the things that Salination could become, why did it become the hallucinogenic nightmare fungus bog? Now, in my opinion, this is because Salination was already kind of inhospitable to a lot of plant life. The entire area is full of very cold saltwater, and very likely without a lot of light, especially after it collapsed, forming a bunch of flooded, cold saltwater caves. Now, perhaps this giant mushroom species is one that thrives in such environments, where large plant life wouldn't be able to take all their nutrients. Maybe they just found a good spot and really just laid claim to it. Now, the mushrooms and the basilisk lizards themselves are fairly interesting, and I'll discuss the latter in Flora Fauna, but for now, the actual region itself, despite how cool it looks, is fairly simple about what it's trying to tell us. When you have a bunch of damp, wet caves that sit alone for a long while, they tend to invite fungi. Okay, and with that, we're finally done talking about the regions that are just variants and subregions of other regions. So, From now on, every region that we discuss is going to be completely disconnected from every other region, and it's going to be like its own little puzzle to solve. Yippee! First off is Badlands, which surprisingly is almost completely unique and has no subregions, despite the other implemented modded regions having a fuckload of them. Though this is likely because this region is technically Badlands 2, an entirely new region utilizing a lot of the ideas from the original Badlands mod, but it's technically a completely new region and made exclusively for the Watcher with no shared rooms with the original mod. So let's get started on analyzing it. The Badlands is a muddy desert region, swarming with a constant stream of locusts that eat anything not covered in mud or lizard spit. Cacti sprout up from large dunes of sand surrounding what looks to be a checkpoint in a large pipeline spanning through the desert. The only structures around here look as though they've been designed to transport or store liquid, with water towers and pipes weaving through a large brick building. This could also explain why there's so much mud. If this is a water pipe that travels through a dusty desert, it would make sense for it to saturate the land into a muddy sludge around it. Besides that, though, the locusts are likely just a swarm passing through the area at the time. Considering their activity, I can't imagine this is a constant occurrence, so I assume the Watcher just came at a really bad time. Next up is a real doozy, Desolate Tract. This area is really weird. It looks to be a large, flat spot riddled with holes that lead down into a bunch of interconnected machinery. That machinery then leads down into a large tunnel that eventually terminates into a flat death plane. So we have a large area dotted with tunnels where wind is constantly blowing through it. The interior of the structure seems to contain a bunch of vertical shafts that lead down between what is likely multiple of these large wind tunnel-like structures. So, what the fuck is this place? What use could the benefactors possibly have for a bunch of tunnels connecting to each other within a giant metal structure? Now, the only two options that I could really think of would be some sort of super advanced wind farm or some sort of launch pad. Considering we've never seen any evidence of the benefactors seeking out space travel, I don't think the launch pad has a lot of evidence towards it. Unfortunately, Desolate Tract could realistically just be something that we have never seen before, or have an analog for. If there was more for me to analyze, I'd probably be able to come up with a better theory. The only thing that I can really say is that it's very likely old, as we can see things like the loaches having properly evolved to survive in this weird, windy place. And most of the inhabitants here are seemingly lizards. So, I'm not entirely sure where they came from, though they do seem to be infesting literally every single region of Rainworld, so that might not be that important. Alright, next up, Torrid Desert. Now, Torrid is, at a glance, fairly simple, but this is an area where some secrets and the wildlife make it a lot easier to tell what's going on. Torrid feels incredibly basic. It's just a desert around some admittedly fairly unique architecture, but there are two things that I feel the need to point out. The first of which is the presence of the boxworms and the drill crabs. The boxworms especially imply a lot of old benefactor presence, as they're only found here and in heat ducts, and the drill crabs are only found in sandy areas, but also look like quite primitive purposed organisms. Torrid Desert itself is split into two-ish separate areas, one that's characterized by being open to the sky and comprised primarily of large sandy plains. The other is seemingly inside, comprised primarily of open rooms filled with tall vertical pillars. Now this latter area is the confusing one to me. I'm not sure if this is just me going insane, but it kinda looks like Shaded Citadel? I'm not sure if other people agree with me, but we know that Shaded Citadel is some sort of religious citadel that was then shaded by 5 pebbles. Could this be another religious citadel built out in the desert? Now, I'm not entirely sure, but it would explain why all the infrastructure looks simultaneously super old and religious-y, while also looking very modern. So I do like the theory, but I understand if it is just me experiencing some notable insanity. Moving on to something a lot easier, Rusted Wrecks. This area is a huge sandy beach covered in a massive oxidized building that has fallen into ruin. Unlike its closest analog, Shoreline, there doesn't seem to be any piping or iterator equipment around here. It actually looks almost completely unique, with a lot of the architecture and room layouts having no analogous structures in the base game map. For this reason, I believe that Rusted Wrecks is either a shipyard or a port, though the lack of docked ships or any cargo does make that theory a little questionable. The sandy beach and rusted architecture implies it's a fairly old structure, as oxidization is fairly rare on the more modern benefactor structures that we see. The wildlife doesn't tell us much outside of the appearance of drill crabs, a creature that only really shows up in deserty areas, which could just be because of the sand, but their presence could also imply rusted wrecks being close by to torrid desert or badlands, but that feels a little too game theory for me, so I don't really want to count it. Overall though, rusted wrecks feels like it should be an easy slam dunk, but it ends up being quite confusing. There's not a lot of pieces of architecture here that can really define what this region is actually for. Alright, time for another doozy, signal spires. I made a big stink about this one in my lore video, but I honestly don't think it's a particularly big deal after looking at it some more. Signal spires comprises two large communication towers above a massive sea of clouds lit up by a rising sun. The area itself is fairly conventional, similar to Sky Islands in that it's just a bunch of basic infrastructure leading upwards. There are some interesting aspects like the sky whales and the trees, but those are just organisms that don't say much about the most interesting aspect of this region, the background. Instead of iterator structures, we can see a lot of these two-pronged signal tower structures. If you look at these structures, they match the layout of the signal spires area itself. The thing that's interesting about this is that they seem fairly similar to iterator structures, which has led a lot of people to theorize that there's some sort of alternate cycle iterator structure, one made in a parallel timeline, or perhaps just a different model from across the days. But my question is, if these are iterator structures, why are they so much comparably smaller? Why don't they have a city? Why are they so heavily focused on transmitting or receiving signals? My theory is that these aren't weird iterator structures, but instead a part of a massive signal array designed to act as a major hub for all the signals that the benefactors would have created and received. Plus, from a meta perspective, I don't think Video Cult would introduce an area where it suggests a whole different type of iterator structure and then not expand on it in any way at all. But who knows? In all fairness, they did make Outer Rim. But we have a lot of video left before we can even begin to think about Outer Rim. So let's move on to Verdant Waterways. Verdant Waterways is fairly simple, all things considered. There's nothing super tough or hard to discern about it. It seems to be some sort of water treatment facility or hydroelectric plant, though it could also just be a drainage system. Either way, it's a facility designed for large volumes of water to move into and out of, and it seems to still be somewhat functional, as the water level fluctuates between a lot of these rooms, going up and down similar to Artificer and Spearmaster's versions of drainage system. Though the most interesting aspect of this region is also its most obvious. Everything is fucking green. It's also important to note that its most common inhabitant is monster kelp. Monster kelp was everywhere in drainage too, but here it really is everywhere. This and the green environment can both be attributed to the same type of thing. The water filtration is likely broken, causing a massive buildup of nutritious settlement and algae, promoting a lot of plant growth. Besides that though, the region itself also looks very similar to the type of machinery we see around the Karma Gates. Look at these rooms, and this spot here that looks almost exactly like a Karma Gate. Could it be a similar technology with water moving through heated filaments to power some big machine? I'm unsure, but it's certainly something to think about. Alrighty, that concludes the last of our discussion of the rottable regions. The next several regions are the super lore important ones that tell us a lot and require a lot of speculation to make sense of. But before we do that, let's start out with something simpler. Let's do a big mashup covering all the rotted variants of the base game regions. The reason why I'm putting all these together is that they don't tell us much unique. The most interesting things about them are what they tell us about the sentient rot strain itself, the way it grows over and around things, and they don't really do anything unique from each other, so they're all getting analyzed at once. Outside of the creatures here, who all seem to be somewhat rotted in their own little special ways, which I will get to in Flora Fauna, the most interesting things are the environment changes the rot causes. The air is thick with these black particulates, and it's colored oddly. The ground is mushy with harmless rot lumps, and these huge pustule-like growths stick out like massive trees, which can block off areas and seem to be too slick to climb on. They're connected by long, swirling stems, and oftentimes we can see what look to be less mature versions of these growths sticking out from around and beneath them. The rot itself also seems to form these filaments that connect to separated platforms. Almost every variant of these regions has all these things that I've mentioned, with the rot even taking the blue fruit and popcorn plants. Easily the most interesting rotted variant of a region, however, is arguably not really includable in that list. That being Unfortunate Evolution. So Unfortunate Evolution is, on the first glance, fairly simple. It's just unfortunate development, but dried out and dead, ruined and filled with old dead rot cysts that line the walls. Those aforementioned rot filaments spider through the open rooms like veins connecting to each other. However, the most interesting part of this region is the motherfucking rot voidworm. Yeah, I said we'd talk about him. I've developed a theory on him, so if you don't remember my Watcher lore theory video, my revised version of that theory is that I believe the rot is the polar opposite to Ascension. Ascension lets one leave behind this world and all of their attachments and desires, ascending to a new plane of existence, whereas getting consumed and assimilated by the rot has the individual descending down to a basal form of life, defined exclusively by those attachments and desires with all individuality removed, returning to, as the prince says, the sediment of life itself. Both are ways of disconnecting oneself from their cycle, but they couldn't be more different. But in difference often comes similarity, which is why I believe the rot voidworm is a variation of the rot that has grown further than any other, mimicking and becoming the things that swim beneath its polar opposite and thematic parallel. Quite the unfortunate evolution. Now, whether this evolution was a conscious thought or a mimicry of some combined hive mind, aka the prince, or just a strange phenomenon caused by the mindless growth of life itself inevitably void-wormifying upon reaching a certain level, I am unsure, and I don't think we're supposed to know. Either way, that's my theory. Thank you for listening. I will take 3 bows and then move on to Shattered Terrace. This area does a good job at making you think it's not all that important until you know what's going on. It looks like some sort of basic building, fairly similar in construction to Aether Ridge, actually, but with a twist. All over the area are these tears that lead into ripple space, the place the Watcher can dip into upon reaching max ripple level. The wind here also seems strange. It spirals around the area like it has a mind of its own, moving about and carrying along flecks of gold within it. Now, I'm certain you could guess by the, look of it, but this is actually the 7th Aether Ridge area. Though admittedly, I don't really think it matters whether or not it's connected to Aether Ridge because there's enough weirdness going on around here, and the facility is so basic except for this one unique thing that I don't really think tying it to Aether Ridge matters at all. What's important in this area are the things that aren't Aether Ridge related, namely the tears into ripple space. So, what's up with that? Why is the area so fucked up? My personal theory for the reasoning behind why this area is so fucked up and weird is that something else with the ability to pass into and out of ripple space has come through here and used its ability many times. Whenever the Watcher tries to enter into its power at later ripple levels, it will leave behind tears that will leak out void spawn, and these tears look very similar to the ones found in Shattered Terrace. Now, the obvious answer for who this mystery entity could be is Spinning Top, as we can also literally find her here in ripple space. But at the same time, that feels a little bit too obvious. Spinning Top is in a lot of other regions, and this is the only one that is this fucked up. So unless this is like her favorite little hangout spot, I don't know. Now, it is also important to note that this area connects to Damon, which feels very important. But this could also just be a gameplay thing. Damon also connects to Outer Rim, and Shattered Terrace, if you aren't aware, houses the only connection to Ancient Urban, which contains the main ending of the DLC. So realistically, I have absolutely no idea. We don't know anywhere near enough about ripple space to theorize why this area is shattered in the way that it is. I know that's not super satisfying, but I would rather make a crackpot theory and then say that I'm dumb than be aggressively incorrect. I know, that's character growth for me. But since we've got Spinning Top on the brain, we should probably talk about Ancient Urban. Ancient Urban is very self-explanatory. There's very little funny business in it that I haven't already discussed in my other video. Ancient Urban is a benefactor's city, one from before the iterators made living on the ground nearly impossible. The benefactors here are all still well and alive. We can see the scale of their items, living spaces, and this one window that lies to you. We can even see a fully functional Ascension temple. How cool! There's not a lot of hidden stuff to address, though. I wonder what this fan-like machine could be. Well, it's probably a big fan. How about this sewer-looking area? Well, it's probably a sewer. Other examples of this simpler-than-you-expect phenomena include this elevator-looking thing that is probably just an elevator, this water tower thing that's probably just a water tower, and these vents that are probably just vents. There's not a lot to interpret here, which I don't mind. I like when the game just shows us things that make sense sometimes. But enough of that coherency. That's baby shit. We Rain World theorists don't have time for that easy nonsense. Let's talk about fucking Damon. Damon is a region that connects to almost every other region in the DLC through portals that are hidden in Ripple Space. Ripple Space itself is weird. It's something we only see in this DLC. At least in my mind, Ripple Space is likely some sort of middle ground between the cycles. Like margins on a page, the space between the things we usually experience, opened by the tears the Watcher opens, accessible only to those beings who are so disconnected from the cycle that they can travel it freely. Damon could just be a place in Ripple Space somewhere, but there are a lot of things that rebuke this idea, one of the bigger ones being that Damon is weirdly liminal, using the dictionary definition of liminal, not the Backrooms definition of liminal, which describes a liminal space as an area that isn't really designed to be its own spot, but rather a place where you pass through instead of staying. Though if Damon is a place within Ripple Space, why are we allowed to enter Ripple Space while inside Damon? Also, why is it that when we fall, we just fall back into the area from the top? Why are there no void spawn here in this Ripple Space-esque spot unless we go into Ripple Space? Now, the main reason why I'm so insistent on Damon being connected to Ripple Space isn't just because it's blue and weird. Not only is Damon absolutely fucking covered in karma flowers, which are their own weird thing, but they seem to enable transportation between cycles, which seems to have something to do with Ripple Space, but it also literally plays a remix or a reimagining of the Ripple Space theme the entire time that you're there. It's actually really cool. It's playing in the background right now. But there is another really weird thing about this region. What's with that name, Damon? Well, if we once again crack open that dictionary, we can find that one of the definitions for a daemon is a background process that handles requests for services such as print spooling and file transfers and is dormant when not required. Now, this doesn't seem super important, but why the fuck else would they name this area Damon? It doesn't look particularly demonic. So, what if Damon is a region that exists exclusively for the Watcher, a connection point through Ripple Space, an area that only exists while the Watcher roams it, a tunnel it created, a process that lies dormant when not in use, something that we can only see and find when looking beneath the observable reality, with the tunnels into it only ever being found within Ripple Space itself. Its size and the fact that you can't fall to your death here also make a good case for Damon's only purpose to exist, being to act as a tunnel for the Watcher to use to get from one area to another. It kind of feels like a cop-out. Wow, this region exists for the Watcher to utilize it. No shit, that's how game design works. But I can't really think of another reason for this area to exist, nor for it to be named the way that it is. Oh, also, another thing. Credit to Ivy on YouTube for their video going into detail on it, but Damon has 2 additional unused pipes that could imply the future existence of 2 more endings. One could be linked to the weird Void Weaver thing that we found in the files, but we don't know yet. That doesn't really tell us much besides, hey guys, did you know that Damon takes you to the 2 ending areas? Whoa, I had no idea. But it's still fun to note. Alright, bitches, I hope no one here is lactose intolerant because it's time for the big cheese, Outer Rim. Oh boy, what a mess this area is going to be to analyze. Outer Rim is a huge, dusty desert filled with old, decrepit structures. The architecture here is foreign to us, being simultaneously similar to the ancients and the benefactors, sporting a lot of their symbols but almost none of their actual architectural stylings. This area features a rotting subregion known as the Throne, which seems to also have a bit of iterator architecture in it. But arguably the most important thing to discuss are the star catchers and the stars themselves. If you look into the background of Outer Rim, you can fairly easily see what looks like a bunch of iterator cans, but cylindrical. These are actually known as star catchers, and they appear to have a hollow interior, likely for catching stars. As a matter of fact, it's highly likely Outer Rim itself takes place on one of these starcatchers, as many of the rooms are labeled as WORA_starcatcher. We can see some rooms seem to include the same tall communication structures that appear to be on the starcatchers in the background. These starcatcher rooms seem to be the more precarious ones, either including jumps over a large pit or a huge vertical column to ascend or descend. This could also be why the region is called Outer Rim, as it could take place on the outer rim of this cylindrical starcatcher structure. But why are they called starcatchers? Well, I assume it's to catch the stars, which are falling. I didn't mention that yet. The same green stars we see in the skies of Rainworld around 5 Pebbles structure in base game can be seen literally falling from the sky, with that dusty wind also picking up a bunch of green particulates labeled in the game files as stardust. Now, as to my theory, I believe that this could be depicting one of the final points in the timeline, so far ahead of everything that the ancients and the benefactors have been forgotten by time. As the cycles have worn on, the dust that fell upon the world has buried everything, turning the entire world into a dusty desert bathed in eternal night. Even the sky itself seems to be collapsing, as the last things the final society to live here did were to try and harness the remaining energy of the fallen cosmic debris. The only creatures that remain here are the weird golden voidy variants of the scavengers, which, it's weird they survived so long, but who knows. There is also something to be said about the prince existing in this region and spreading out from it. The rot that the prince spreads is a unique strain, having grown and evolved through an assumedly unknowable amount of time, having consumed either an iterator or something else it can mimic consciousness from. Bringing this ravenous strain of sentient rot back in time to other areas is likely why it can so easily infect them. Now, this theory could be entirely bunk. Maybe this area is called Outer Rim because it's the space-time equivalent of the rural shit shack your real estate agent insists is a fixer-upper. I have no idea. But the theory is also kind of questionable because of the fact that we can see what looks to be very clear benefactor presence here. If this is the end of the timeline and the benefactors have led an entire society into ruin and this is just another one that came along thousands or millions of cycles in the future, why are they still using the benefactors' karma symbols? Why is their architecture so weirdly iterator-esque? Why does the prince look like an iterator? Maybe everything I've said is wrong and I'm going insane. Outer Rim, baby. But anyways, that's the end of the video. Quite the long one. I hope my analyses answered some questions or made people angry enough to answer those questions in the comment section. The next video is likely going to be the next region concept, which my Discord is wrapping up now. Or maybe it'll be something easy. It depends on how long that region concept takes me to make. Either way, thank you all for watching. Press the validation buttons and subscribe to my Patreon. Forfeit all your mortal possessions to the Das Zombies YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.